Welcome to the Spirit Room. This podcast is a gathering place for people in search of personal growth and life's higher meaning. I'm your host, Mike Consul. I also invite you to spend time on the Spirit Room website, where you'll find headlines about religion, spirituality, psychology, and the New Age movement. Just go to thespiritroom.org. Back in the mid-1980s, I was working as an editor for a small weekly newspaper in Sedona, Arizona. And during that time, I interviewed a woman named Lois Stelvey. She was a published author of several books, and I presume, it was a long time ago, so I don't exactly remember, but I presume I was interviewing her about her writing career. And I'm speaking of Lois in past tense because in 2004, as we sometimes say, she left the body. She was considerably older than me at the time, was sitting there smoking cigarettes back in the day when people were allowed to smoke indoors in offices. And during that interview, she told me something that I've never forgotten, that I want to share with you right now. And that is that in her earlier days, when she was going to job interviews, she had this practice. She would show up at the interview site an hour early. Then she would find a coffee house nearby. She would sit down, order a cup of coffee, sit there and sip her coffee and tell herself nice things about herself. So that by the time she actually needed to show up for the interview, she was feeling a boosted level of self-confidence, of self-esteem, and she was really prepared to put on a good performance during the job interview. It worked very well for her. This is what she told me. Even though I always remembered what Lois had told me, it was several years later that I actually attempted it for the first time. This was my first exposure to something called self-talk. And I remember I was driving in a car. I was not going to a job interview, but I just started trying out this practice that Lois Stelvey had told me about. And as I was driving, I was telling myself some things I was grateful for and taking credit for having certain skills that I have, and generally thinking in terms of what looked like a very bright future to me at the time. And I was amazed. I probably went on that way for 10 minutes, 15 at the most, but I was absolutely amazed at what it did for my energy level. My energy level just made a quantum leap or two. And the overall energy level, optimism, and excitement were really high after spending that little bit of time talking to myself in a way that was really positive. And it was years after that I ran across a book. In fact, I ran into a woman at a business event, and she told me that she had been suicidal at some point in her life. And of course, I started asking questions. That's what I do. I ask a lot of questions when I'm with people. She was obviously very open, so I had no qualms about digging a little bit deeper. She was very forthcoming with the situation that she had been through. And she said she had read a book that saved her life. And I said, "What's the name of the book?" And she said, "What to Say When You Talk to Yourself." So it's a self-talk book. Went out and bought a copy right away because I wanted to learn more about it. It was written by a psychiatrist. I believe he was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, PhD. Interesting book, and this fellow went so far as to say that I'd give you the name, but it's an odd name. He would go so far as to actually write the scripts. He would write model scripts for you to read, to memorize. They really were not so much to read or to memorize. I don't think. I think his real intent was, and again, I read this book a long time ago, probably 25 years ago. His real intent was to actually give you some models that you could use, because the scripts themselves didn't really appeal to me, but they served as models that showed me how I might script the things that I would say to myself on a continuing basis that's meaningful. By meaningful, I mean meaningful to me. Obviously, word choice for self-talk would be different from one person to another. One of the reasons self-talk is really important is this woman who I was just mentioning who was suicidal. It changed the tapes that were playing in her head. One of the things that psychologists and psychiatrists tell us is that when people are devastatingly depressed, or just even depressed in general, it is often being driven by internal self-talk, sometimes on a almost subliminal level, thoughts that are going through the mind that some people aren't even aware are going through the mind, which makes it all the more important that we replace that we eradicate it, we replace it, or at least overlay it with our own positive thoughts, our own positive self-talk. But a lot of people have these very chatty minds, and when a mind is very chatty, there's no telling what it's actually going to say. A lot of people internally do a lot of rapid-fire thinking. That thinking over time can become quite negative if things don't work out in a person's life, or a person can often gravitate to the negative. In fact, some of the material I've read over the years suggests that we are of that nature, that we gravitate to the negative. It's part of the human condition. So it really does take a pitched effort to keep ourselves on a positive note, to keep ourselves from going into these negative tapes that can drag us down. One of the reasons why electroconvulsive therapy, also known simply as shock treatments, is effective for people who have a serious case of depression and the normal SSRIs are not helping them, or regular talk therapy is not helping them. The reason they will use electroconvulsive therapy is that shock treatment actually wipes out recent memory. So that really negative, sometimes subliminal tape, as I say, that's playing in their heads is actually erased. It's almost like hitting a reset button. And they get tremendous relief. I mean, I know people who have done electroconvulsive therapy to good effect, which is why it's still in use today. Far more effective and far more precise, far less scary than it used to be. I mean, if you ever saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it just looks horrifying. So electroconvulsive therapy has advanced quite a bit and can be quite effective. But we don't want to go there. What we want to do is make sure that if we have a talkative mind, which I happen to not have, I don't have a chatty mind. It turns out that I'm amazed sometimes at how quiet my mind is when I'm, say, commuting to work or sitting and watching a television program or taking a walk. But something's going on in there. There's no question about that, and maybe it's going on at a subliminal level. So whether the mind is chatty or it's not chatty, the idea is, with self-talk, to be able to have really positive inputs. And we don't have to go over the top. People can sometimes be self-conscious about this whole process. They feel funny about telling themselves positive things about themselves. It doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be super overt. We could even have positive thoughts about other people. We get positive thoughts about people in our lives, people we care about, people we love, family members, friends, and significant others. There's plenty of information out there on self-talk. What I would recommend is to go ahead and integrate it into your day, because think about the times when you're standing in line at a grocery store, or perhaps you're commuting in a car, or you just have any kind of dead time during the day. Now, we tend to do what? We tend to go to our smartphones or tablets and occupy ourselves with that. But it would probably be a good idea to spend some time actually using this mental health technique. And it's not just a mental health technique. It's not just something to avoid depression with. It's something to maximize your own mental state. The other option is to treat it as a meditation, to set aside 10 or 15 minutes each day and actually sit down and consciously start your day or finish your day or both, sitting down and doing some meditative self-talk and implanting really positive narratives or scenarios about yourself. Let's also remember that during the day, any given day, something goes wrong, we get into a really sideways mood. If we were to take a 5-minute break and just try to hit that reset button with some positive self-talk, see what kind of difference it makes. And just as I mentioned in a previous podcast about a gratitude journal, look for opportunities to be non-repetitious with the inputs. We don't want to say the same things over and over again, because repetition is fine for a lot of things, but it can also reduce the impact. How often can we tell ourselves a certain thing before it just becomes less effective, doesn't have the impact? So let's spend a little bit of time thinking in terms of what really lands with me, what really scores with me, what kind of phrasing really strikes home. Because everybody's different that way. And everybody finds different things truly meaningful. And obviously I'm talking about internal self-talk, but how often have we met people whose mind chatter is actually external? They'll say what's going on in their mind, and they will oftentimes, we've all known people who say negative things. They just outwardly say negative things. These are the things that we want to stem, prevent from happening to ourselves. So ask yourself that question: what do you say when you talk to yourself? Sit and think for a little while about what the answer to that question is. Do we really know? Are we monitoring that internal monologue, or is it just floating past and we're not letting it register in any real way, not a conscious way anyway? Because it will register. It's just a matter of, are we conscious of it, and are we stamping out the bad and propagating the good, or not? We know what works. We know that if you tell a child terrible things about himself or herself and do that over the course of years, that child's going to have problems. Well, it's no different for us. We tell ourselves bad things about ourselves, maybe even terrible things about ourselves, not even intentionally. It's just something that our mind gravitates to over time, and it's going to cause problems. So take control of that situation. Give yourself the benefit of positive thinking. If people can be driven to suicide by negative thoughts that keep replaying in their mind, think of what those same thoughts turned positive can do for a person. Think of what they can do for you or for me. And let me leave you with one other thing, and that is that self-talk is something that feels awkward in the beginning for a lot of people. Not everybody, but for a lot of people, self-talk seems overly self-conscious. It seems awkward. It takes a little bit of practice, like any type of new activity. It takes a little bit of practice before we get comfortable with it, and it becomes second nature and even comforting to us. So give it some time. Start slowly and just escalate from there. It really will make a difference. That's it for this episode of The Spirit Room. Godspeed.